Greetings to you all. It's been very striking to me that despite the relatively small number of Armenians in London and in Great Britain, it has become a place of very high quality thinking and lately publishing about diaspora. There are people who are or were members of the London community. For example, my old friend Razmik Panosyan, for example, Sosi Kasparyan, both of whom did their PhDs in London. I had the pleasure of being the external examiner for Sosi Kasparyan's dissertation, and she's now a co-editor of the journal Diaspora. Other people from Haratch Press to people who've come and gone, like Khachig Tölölyan, there has been a lot of intellectual ferment coming out of the relatively small community of London and the United Kingdom. I noticed that IB Tauris and the Edinburgh University Press are two of the presses that are publishing a great deal of work on Armenians. I don't know what it is you're doing, but you're doing very well in terms of contributing to Armenian intellectual and collective life. That said, I'm a person for whom it's easy to talk for hours about the diaspora. You can understand why. But giving a 30-minute talk is harder. What I'm going to do is make a series of comments. That is to say, I do not have a lecture that I'm going to read. I'm going to make a series of comments that I hope are at least loosely linked. And what my hope is that it will elicit comments, questions, and argument. I'll start by saying that at a certain level, every Armenian thinks of himself or herself as a diaspora specialist. In informal conversations, things get very hot very fast because of this. I hope in a more temperate way that happens here. One of the things that has been happening in the last few years especially is that when someone finds out what I do, I get lectured very self-confidently, if briefly, in the following way. Don't you know that there is no diaspora? This is actually a position, an opening position in many conversations. I'm told that there is no diaspora. There are only diasporan communities. I'm told that diaspora flattens out the variety, the diversity of the reality of Armenian communities. I'm as polite as I can be in responding. I would say that diaspora with a capital D is a concept. It's first of all a concept, and that concept exists and has existed for something close to 2,400 years. Not originally Armenian, as you know, originally Greek and Jewish, but Armenian probably since the middle of the 12th century in various ways. But secondly, diasporas don't exist in the following sense. I think the two people who've said this most often are myself and a Chinese-Canadian scholar named Lily Cho. For example, how do we know something exists? One way we know it, aside from the word and the concept, is that it has embodiment in something like, for example, the laws of a nation. The vast majority of nations don't have a legal corpus of rulings and judgments about diasporas per se. That is, the United States is full of diasporas, large or small, but there's no law that is the law of diasporas. On the other hand, Hungary has a law of diasporas and insists, or at least no, that insists is wrong. It gives a choice to minority communities as to whether they want to be organized as a diaspora or not. It's striking that of the nearly 20 diaspora communities in Hungary, all, including the Armenian, are organized as diasporas according to the rules of the government, regulations of the government. One community refused to be a diaspora, the Jewish one, the largest one. It said, we want to be recognized simply as the citizens of the state. We don't want a special position as a diaspora, even though it incorporates us and gets us support from the government, because we think that it's dangerous to think that way. So my point being here that on the one hand, diaspora exists as a concept. On the other hand, diasporan communities exist in infinite variety, so it's not easy to generalize. And on the third hand, diaspora does not exist in an organized and regular fashion among the governments of the world and among transnational bodies. The United Nations does not have a particular diaspora bureau, for example. So much has been said and done about diaspora, but despite the fact that it exists only in certain ways, not in others. And that's because, of course, diaspora also has power as a concept, and it has affect as a concept. Affect, in the larger sense of a collective emotion, is very powerfully attached to diasporas. The Jewish and Armenian ones, obviously, but many others as well. And that affect, when correctly mobilized, has resulted in diasporas being influential. So on the one hand, they don't have any legal existence in the United States as communities, but they tremendously influenced certain US policies. Much of US foreign policy towards the Middle East is essentially a response to the influence of the Jewish lobby. At certain times, even the Armenian lobby in the mid to late 1990s had influence on the way the US behaved towards Azerbaijan for 5 or 6 years. That was actually the case. So it exists and it doesn't exist. Let's keep that in mind. One of the things when I teach to undergraduates, I try to say to them, let's put nation over here in one column and diaspora over here and do a comparison. What do nations have? They have physical territory. Diasporas don't have physical territory. Or if they do, it's like Burj Hammoud in Beirut. It's like 5 kilometers square, where there used to be 85,000 Armenians at one point, no longer. They don't have territory that is fundamental to the nation state. They don't have, in a certain sense, society. Society is a very conflicted concept now. There's a British sociologist named John Urry, U-R-R-Y, who has actually written that there no longer is a British society, that Britain is a number of societies that actually are closed off from each other. And there are certainly societies or communities in the US that are cut off from the larger society. But we cannot speak of a diasporic society. Not even the most closely organized diasporas can be said to have a diasporic society. They have multiple communities, as we all know and understand, but no diasporic society. There is, of course, no diasporic state. That is, by definition, almost a quality of nations. And what this means, it's not so much that there isn't a state, it's that the state was organized, at least since the 1640s, as the spokesperson for the people that it ruled in international communities. States spoke to other states, claiming to represent the nation. There is no one who can represent the Armenian diaspora. There is no organization that can speak in the name of the Armenian diaspora. Even the most highly organized Jewish diaspora, there is no organization that can speak in the name of it in general. Only in specific countries when organized as lobbies. And that was one of the reasons why both the Armenian Assembly and the Armenian National Committee, which was organized by the Tashnaq Party, were so important, because they claimed to speak in the name of the Armenian community of the United States. And in doing so, they had gained some legitimacy, partly because of money and partly because of votes in certain places. That is to say, in certain places, there were Armenians in large enough concentration so that they could speak through the vote and therefore represent themselves as a totality. Behind this is something that I'm not going to go into unless you folks want to go into it. One of the really major questions behind a lot of humanities and social sciences thinking about diasporas and about other things, but about diasporas, is the question of representation. And the question of representation was first formulated in this way by Karl Marx in a short book called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, which was about the French revolutions of 1848 to 1852. But because Marx was Marx, it was picked up and eventually became general. What Marx was saying is that the question of who represents the people is never a settled question. Even in a nation state like France or the United States, if I say who speaks for the American people, what's the standard answer? It's whoever gets the majority vote and becomes president or prime minister. But as recent events of the last 4 or 5 years have shown, you can be president of the United States while getting only 38 or 40% of the vote. You do not represent the majority of the American people. You certainly do not speak for all of the American people. I don't know how many of you feel that your current prime minister speaks for the English or British people, But even, my point being that even in societies as established with profound parliamentary traditions like Britain, it's not easy to say who speaks for you, except in the sense that if England is speaking in the United Nations, you know who speaks for England. I'm not saying that's unimportant, that's very important. But all of the discussion that goes on about diaspora and unity, diaspora or representative bodies, runs up against this fact that even in organized nation states, who represents the nation and speaks for the nation is a troubling and difficult question. For our diaspora, a very difficult one. What Marx was saying was that, first of all, that's difficult to establish what it means to truly say, I represent the people, I speak for the people. It takes a lot to be able to say that. But he also was suggesting that there are other forms of representation. And those forms of representation are, broadly speaking, I'm going to say cultural, but at different times it has been in literature that has represented the interests and drives. So in the middle of the 19th century, Charles Dickens represented the British people at least as much as any member of parliament did, probably more influentially than any 10 members of parliament. In Armenia, Rafi, the novelist, represented the Armenian people at least as importantly as half a dozen leaders of the Tiflis or Istanbul Armenian community. But also representation can take many forms. And today we are faced, the diasporas are being transformed because they're faced by a new form of representation. Because of the digital universe, almost any Armenian can feel that he is representing himself or herself within a generalized context, that they're speaking to thousands, maybe millions of people. You probably know that Kim Kardashian represents herself, so to speak, has more followers than President Trump does. And he has 84 million. She has, I think, about something like 110 million globally. I don't keep up very well with these things. Once in a while I read figures. So the question of what it means to represent your collectivity is a very complicated one. I will close this part of my discussion by saying that way back in the 80s and early 90s, I was sort of made a touring lecturer for the Zorian Institute, with which I've been involved for several decades. And one of the talks I gave was about what in the United States we called leadership. But of course, leadership and representation are closely linked. Those who speak for a collectivity are often its leaders, not its followers. And before I started talking at those events, I would hand out one single sheet of paper with a couple of questions. And one of them was, name one person who you think of as a leader of the Armenian people outside the homeland. Name a diasporic leader. And with astonishing consistency, the answers were the name of one Catholicos or another, the name of Alek Manugyan, who was the head of the AGBU and also in the United States the most generous donor to a variety of causes, and much more rarely the name of one or another prominent figure in either the Tashnag or the Ramgavar parties. That was it. That was the Armenian concept of leadership. The church, the philanthropists, and the politicized intellectuals. And that has been the case in most of Armenian history in diaspora for 150 years. When the Armenian diaspora has worked best in certain communities has been where the church leadership, the wealthy philanthropists, and the intellectual leadership have actually seen eye to eye. That has happened most prominently in the 1850s and 60s in Lebanon. In Istanbul. It happened again in Lebanon briefly, but basically it doesn't happen for very long. That is, it comes together and then splits apart again. So this question of weighs on my mind, and I'm emphasizing it, I'm devoting a lot of time to it, because when we talk about homeland-diaspora relations, very often people mean the homeland as led by, let's say, Nikol Pashinyan, and the diaspora as led by, excuse me, who again? Or which organization again? So one of the things to do is to see that the discourse of homeland-diaspora relations is undercut. It's not destroyed, but it's undercut or qualified by the fact that no one can speak for the diaspora in the way that Pashinyan can speak for the homeland. And you may want to raise questions about that, but let's start with that. No one can do so, and so the question has to be rephrased. One of the things that I often say to people is, look, if you start thinking of diaspora's relation to the Republic of Armenia since 1988, since the earthquake, or since 1991, independence, when people talk about that, you know what they're talking about? They're not talking about the diaspora's relation. They're talking about the relationship between Levon Ter-Petrosyan and the Tashnak party, and the disagreements, and the jailings, and so forth and so on. When they talk about Robert Kocharyan, about diaspora homeland relations, they talk about President Kocharyan and the passing of the law concerning dual citizenship. Some of you may know, many of you may not, that the original Armenian constitution did not allow dual citizenship and was discouraging of any kind of diaspora attempts to get citizenship, was severe. And Kocharyan loosened that up. I don't know if you yourselves think of this, well, so what? It's natural. That's what diaspora homeland relations are. But I'm going to continue discussion. I'm going to suggest that they need not be the only ones. But in truth, whether we move on to Serge Sarkisyan and the protocols and the genocide issues, so forth and so on, all the way to Pashinyan, what people mean by diaspora homeland relations is all too often weighted too much towards institutions which are indisputably important. Of course, the ARF is an important institution. Of course, the AGBU is an important institution. But those institutions cannot be said to represent the diaspora in any full and democratic way. And that's a problem for us all. So, the question of relationship then is, well, if it's not a relationship between 2 or 3 leading figures and institutions like the ARF or the AGBU and the Armenian government, or it's not enough to think of it that way, how should we think of it? I'm going to draw a little bit on a personal experience. About, I forget the exact date, about 12, 13 years ago, I was invited as a consultant to Balboa on the north coast of Spain, in a city that is predominantly Basque. And the people who invited me was the País Vasco, Euskadi, the government of the Basque Autonomous Region. Now, why would they invite an Armenian there? One, because they know about us. Basques know about Armenians more than you'd think. The Basque intellectual elite does. But primarily because the Basque Autonomous Region had decided that it was going to undertake a large multi-year initiative in which it would attempt to speak to Latin America and also to the Philippines. The Philippines were a Spanish colony until the 1890s. And because in both those places, in all over Latin America, from Mexico to Tierra del Fuego, but also in the Philippines, there are many people who know that they're Basque in origin. And the Basque government wanted to know, how do we construct a constituency of Basques who are willing to select themselves out and say, yes, we're not just Argentinian or Peruvian or Filipino, we're also Basque, and we have a special relationship with the Basque country. So notice how here the government takes the initiative not to speak to an existing diaspora, but to encourage the emergence of one. Now, of course, they had done preliminary spade work, footwork, and some of the people who were there were wealthy Basque origin businessmen from other places, and a couple of people who were considered Basque cultural leaders. But what that meant mostly was they had worked with the Basque government in bringing Basque dance troupes and Basque theater to their communities. And this is something familiar to all of us, isn't it? We've seen Armenian cultural organizations, dance, music, etc., come to us. And it was fascinating to me for this 3-day conference to see how they were struggling to say, since we are not the government of Spain, we can't claim to speak politically to other Basques. We have to speak culturally. How do we do that? Part of what was interesting to me, and I think it's interesting, should be interesting to us if we're thinking as Armenians, is that they had a very hard business sense. They wanted to know not only what can we do, but what will it cost? How will we know whether the costs had results? How will we compare the results? By that I mean something like this. Supposing the government of Armenia said, we will spend, I don't know, $5 million sending cultural ambassadors all over the Armenian diaspora. It'll be music, dance, exhibitions of paintings from the Armenian museums, all of those good things, right? That costs money. And of course, man hours. The question would be, how do we, even let's say it's successful, we can say, look, in California, 20,000 people visited the exhibit of paintings from Yerevan's museums. Good. How do we know if that's, do you know the American expression, are you getting the bang for your buck? Getting a bang for your buck means you spend $1, a single dollar, you got something for it. There are complicated ways in which people look at and judge this. And they were trying to figure out, how would we know what works? And I said, since I'm a professor, just in passing in one of the conversations, I said, do you have Basque students from other countries come to study here? They said, yeah, some come to try to learn Basque. They're interested. It's a difficult language for them. They come to learn Basque. And I said, what does it cost them and what does it cost you? And we got into talking about how you cost out. First, how much does it cost to bring someone from the diaspora to the homeland? And how do you know whether that was money well spent as opposed to something else? I raised the same question in Armenia. And I raised it with two people. One worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and one was an academic. And both of them were enthusiastic about the policies that from the 70s, I guess, I don't know, perhaps Tatevik does. From what year to what year did they bring substantial numbers of Armenian students especially from Haleb and Beirut, to study in Hayastan at the government's expense? It was very interesting for me to, see that they thought it was worthwhile. There are debates about whether it was worthwhile or not. In Aleppo at one point, the worried leaders of the subterranean ARF were saying, Hayastan is staffing all the national institutions in Haleb with people who trained in Hayastan. Hayastan used to produce very good dance teachers, and so they were talking about that almost resentfully. But in general, the reaction was positive. This is the kind of thing I mean. Is it worthwhile? I will ask you to think about this. Is it worthwhile if the government of Armenia comes up with, say, $10 million it barely has, and a rich diaspora organization comes up with 20 million, and they initiate in a whole new way, taking Armenian students from diaspora to the homeland for a semester or a year in Armenia? Is that a good expenditure of money? The reason why we do not have the relations with the homeland that we should is that we do not have established fundraising for that. It's all piecemeal. We do not have we do not have ways of judging what are the comparable ways in which a cooperation like that pays off. By comparable, I mean, instead of spending 10 million of the Armenian government's money and $20 million of diaspora money, would it be better to adopt, 5 villages and equip them with everything they need? How do you know? This is something that in highly organized other places, whether places which are well organized to attract diaspora cooperation, whether it's Israel or China or now India, increasingly, there are people who are thinking about this kind of thing. And what has happened is that there's been a tremendous acceleration of this for political reasons. Let me take a couple of minutes to sketch this out. Originally, Danish professors who studied certain poor African countries started saying sotto voce, with a low voice, there are Africans now working in Europe who could be talked into sending more money more effectively if the governments of the homeland, the African governments of the homeland, had a way of showing to these people that the money would be used effectively, since much money that goes to Africa notoriously gets lost into the pockets of government officials. We Armenians are familiar with that from the past 20 years of Armenian government. Once the Danish Africanists started this, other people pitched in, and there was a big, entirely academic debate. Then a man called Dilip Rotha, who is an Indian-American economist, who was running part of the World Bank, took this up. He took it up partly because he knew how much Indian money had started going to India. And he said, we need to be able to do this more systematically. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She put out an advertisement for the first conference on diaspora money being sent to the homeland. And this all of a sudden became a very big thing in the United States. I don't know if the British government has done anything like this. But what has become an almost international question now is, how should diasporas be organized with the help of international organizations to send money to the homeland? Partly the undercurrent of this is Western Europe and the United States are cutting back on foreign aid. And if President Trump had his way, foreign aid would be cut to zero. So the diasporas have to step in and pick up the burden. This has become, there's a whole subdivision of diaspora studies that works on this. And the question is, what are the implications of this for Armenia? What we have in Armenia so far, that is, if we look at 1991 to say a couple of years ago, we have two things. That primarily the government of Armenia, speaking for the Armenian people, has said they want investment, not just donations, but investment. But of course, the Armenia Fund depended on donations that the government invested in everything from road building to whatever. So the demand has been economic, and a much lesser demand from the Armenian government has been political. My own conviction, having worked with the Armenian Assembly for many years, is that the Armenian government wasn't actually very good at using the Armenian lobby in the United States. In the end, the Armenian lobby, especially in my view, the Armenian Assembly, was teaching the government of Armenia representatives what lobbying was and how it could work, instead of the other way around. But this is nearly universal. The scholar Alan Gamlen, Gamlen, who is the world's leading person on these matters, says that now of the 181 countries in the world, states in the world, 80 have diaspora organizations somewhere in the government. Some of them have ministries. Some, like Armenia, had ministries and took it away, but they have bureaus. And they're organizing this so that the government has a formal mechanism to interact with its diaspora. So this is now a international, transnational, almost global phenomenon. How it's working is very difficult to assess. We have cases like India and China where we can assess this. We have, of course, the case of Israel where we can assess this. And assessments of Armenia, probably right now, I don't know if there's one that really works. At one point, I remember Haratch Press doing a study of what money diaspora had sent to the homeland. It was a very impressive one, but it was a while ago. So I don't know where we stand now. I wish I had good figures to give you and say, look, this is what we as a collection of diaspora communities have done. But there isn't a single assessment. What is happening, however, in these neoliberal economic times is that people are rethinking, in a way that's both interesting and disturbing, they're rethinking the diaspora in economic terms. So what I'm going to read for you is a passage from a recent dissertation, not written by an Armenian, but by an American researcher, actually a Polish Jewish American researcher, but the entire dissertation is about Armenia. And one of the things she does at the very end of the interesting dissertation is to talk about how the Armenian rich are changing their thought away from philanthropy towards investment. But they're using a language that is not the Armenian government's language. So I'm now going to read you a passage from this dissertation. The dissertation says, Nubar Afeyan characterizes Armenia as a startup. I don't know if all of you know what a startup is, but most of you do. He reframes, F-R-A-M-E-S, sovereignty as a project of economic rather than national political independence. Reframes sovereignty as an economic rather than national political project. The Armenian nation and its diaspora are reimagined as a community of shareholders with a stake in the success of Armenia, the country. So the country's economic success has all Armenians potentially as shareholders in it. Each and all are incentivized to engage and invest to the best of their abilities in order to see their individual share, just like a stock is a share in a company, appreciate in a joint venture of national development. So what she's arguing is that she's interviewed Afeyan and studied his speeches, and she's arguing that this is an economistic vision of what used to be political. There is, of course, nothing wrong with thinking about the economic welfare of Armenia, but part of the problem of rethinking sovereignty in this way is that it doesn't explain why there are 19-year-olds dying on the borders of Armenia. That you cannot, I mean, there's a fundamental shortcoming of neoliberal capitalist thinking. It doesn't understand that, especially in countries like Armenia, which are endangered, people will fight and die. They're not going to fight and die either for Antranik whatever was his name, the billionaire, I've forgotten his name, Zarugyan's fortune, nor will they, not Antranik Zarugyan is a writer, Gagik Zarugyan's fortune, nor will they die for any successful economic venture in Armenia. It's very, very hard for a nation under military threat to think of itself simply or even primarily as an economic formation, although everybody recognizes we Armenians are not stupid in this matter. We recognize the importance of economics. But in any case, the reason I cite this is that it asks the question, can the diaspora reimagine and reinvent its relationship to the homeland? Or better yet, can the homeland reimagine its relationship to the diaspora in a way that actually speaks to the diaspora? I'm going to finish by, I think I'm close to half an hour, right? So I'm going to finish by saying that there are various ways in which this is being done. And again, people have studied this in many countries, but Birthright Armenia is probably one of the places where I see a promising amount of inventiveness in the last year or two in changing the original concept so that more and more ways exist of engaging Armenia from the diaspora, not simply going through political elites, not simply going through political organizations, which, however useful, represent at best 25% of the Armenian people. My own feeling is that if you add up the membership of existing political parties and major organizations like the AGBU, and even minor organizations, altogether, they, depending on the community, they don't represent more than a quarter or a third of all the Armenians in diaspora. Massively, Armenians in the diaspora are not engaged by these organizations. So it's necessary to reimagine the various ways in which we can be linked to Armenia, we can engage in various kinds of activities in it, and that work is just beginning. I can say a great deal more about this, but I'd rather we talked. Thank you.